All right. Well, next, now we're going to talk about the stage model of the research process. So brace yourself. It's going to look linear and then it's going to turn into a circle. So get ready. All right. So, first off, you formulate a hypothesis. Either it came from a theory and that's what spawned your hypothesis, or maybe you've just been reading other people's research and it caused you to think, I wonder if I changed this one variable, what would happen, kind of thing. So you formulate a hypothesis from whatever inspiration. Next, you design your study, figure out how you're going to collect the data, what you're going to use as your dependent variables. Are you going to be doing descriptive or explanation? You figure it out. You design your study. Now you collect your data. Then you have to analyze your data. Ideally, it'll be quantitative data that will allow you to do statistical analyses, but sometimes in descriptive, you might be doing maybe just some descriptive statistics, little means and medians, stuff like that. But you do whatever process you can. You report your results. Maybe it's so interesting that you are able to publish it. Maybe it's so new that you're able to take it to a conference and you're like, I don't know, this is the beginning of my research. This is what I'm finding so far. In one way or another, you put it out into the public. Okay, maybe it's just you're at the very beginning and you just talk about it with your colleague down the hall. Like, who knows? But you report the results. A lot of times when you report the results, you get a little bit of feedback that allows you to say, oh my gosh, I have a new idea. And you formulate a new hypothesis. So I like to call this not just the stage model of the research process, but I would also like to call it the circle of hell of the research process, where every time you get done with a study and you've had a chance to report it, get some feedback, next thing you know, you're like, I've got a new idea. I call it the circle of hell very jokingly because actually that's called a research program, right? Where you've got just idea after idea of things to follow up with. And that's really like when you're in that groove, it's very inspiring because you like every answer causes you to like think of another question. Super exciting, super fun. Also, you sometimes get stuck in a circle. So this is kind of the model of how we go through the process. Let's talk about some designs that are available to us for collecting data. There are experimental methods that are going to require random assignment to condition and manipulation of the variables. You are not able to do a true experiment if you can't meet both of those criteria. So you need to be able to randomly assign the participants to the condition that they're going to experience, and you're going to manipulate that variable. Sometimes you do it in a lab, right? So, of course, lab experiments are going to be true experiments, so they have random assignment, the manipulation of the variables, and we're in a lab, so it's a controlled setting. Maybe you might want to do it out in the world. That's called a field experiment. So in a field experiment, which is different from a field study, a little bit different. So a field experiment is where you still are going to randomly assign participants, you're going to manipulate the variables, but you're going to do it in a natural setting. So in IO psychology, when we do experiments, a lot of times it's a field experiment where you say, okay, well, I'm going to take like half of the employees, I'm going to randomly assign them to be in this condition, and half of the employees are going to be randomly assigned to be in this condition. It's still in the workplace. It might even be occurring right at their own normal work desk or their own workstation or where they normally are, but they've been assigned to a condition. And that's what makes it an experiment. It's happening out in the world, in the natural setting, but you do have control over those variables. Okay, now stepping away from true experiments, now we are talking about quasi-experiments. What makes a quasi-experiment is that instead of random assignment, you're going to use the existing groups that the participants already belong to. You're going to manipulate some other variable. That's what the experiment part's going to be. But the quasi part is that you can't randomly assign participants to one of the variables of interest. Maybe you're going to use sex as a variable. So you can't randomly assign people to be one sex or the other, and so you have to use their existing sex. Well, now we automatically are in a quasi-experiment. Maybe you can't randomly assign your employees to job type, and so maybe you're just going to use that job type. So maybe you're within an organization, you've got maybe the administrative staff, maybe you've got the engineers, and maybe you've got the people who like put things together. And so you go, well, we've got these 3 different classes of employees, and so we'll use that as a variable. And then maybe now we manipulate some other variable and see what impact that has. Generally, in quasi experiments, we're going to do this in a controlled setting, maybe not a lab, but some kind of controlled setting. So, probably not at their desk or something like that. Observational methods, you don't do any random assignment, you don't manipulate any variables. Maybe it's a controlled setting, maybe you bring them into a specific room or into a laboratory, maybe for the observation, or maybe you do it in the natural setting. Maybe you just, in fact, directly observe whatever's just naturally happening. So, IO psychology tends to be comprised of the bottom three types of research. Typically, it's field experiments, quasi experiments, and observational methods. Those are the more common ways of doing research in IO psychology. Hardly ever lab experiments. When it is lab experiments, it's a lot of times not employees, it's students who are sort of standing in as employees. So yeah, because it's kind of hard to get employees into the actual lab. And most of the things that employers want to look at, they're not looking at that kind of control. They're wanting it to happen at like a natural setting. So they might be more interested in a field experiment or something like that. Kind of got to do what the client wants. If you're doing basic research in IO psychology, you probably would be doing lab experiments and probably using students. Not always, but more likely. So some data collection techniques. So naturalistic observation, this would be the picture says studying of humans in their natural environment. So this is where you're actually going to go to the natural place where the behavior is likely to be emitted. In the case of IO psychology, probably the workplace. And you're going to try to observe the behavior of the participants, they're the subjects, as unobtrusively as possible. You don't want them to notice that you're watching them and recording what they're doing. You might be taking notes. Maybe you have hidden cameras, depending on your budget. Maybe you might engage in what we call participant observation, which is where you become a member of the group. Like there was a classic one where a woman actually went through the whole police academy and got hired by the police department, and then from inside the police department was conducting a participant observation study of how women were treated in the police department. And that can be kind of a ethical conundrum to have, this kind of participant observation where you're doing research on your colleagues who don't know that you're doing research. Like that can be problematic. But this brings up a good time. This is a good time to mention that observations that occur in public, you really don't have an expectation of privacy when you're in public. And so whether you think I'm your coworker or you think I'm just some stranger who happens to also be out in public, you don't have any expectation of privacy. And so it's kind of okay to be watching people, even writing things down. You can't record their voices in most states, but you can video record them, silent, things like that. Case studies are when you work with one or maybe just a few people who belong to a special population. So in IO psychology, maybe we're going to be studying CEOs. There aren't that many CEOs in the world, and even fewer who are willing to talk to a researcher. And so you might do a really in-depth case study on the few that you can get to agree to do it. And so in these case studies, there would probably be interviews, maybe some kinds of like cognitive tasks or perceptual tasks or attitude scales or things that you would administer to, one, two, or a handful maybe of people who are in this special population. Case studies on their own are never that interesting to just have this one case study that reports on one person or something. Where case studies are really useful is when, I publish mine that's on this one person, you publish yours that's on a different person, somebody over on the East Coast publishes theirs that's on a different person, and now we've got 5 or 6 different individual case studies that we can start looking at as if they are cohesive and meaningful, and we can start to establish patterns. That's how they discovered some of the precursors to, at the time, what was called multiple personality disorder. Today we call it dissociative identity disorder. But that's how they started figuring out any of the factors that go into the development of that disorder. Individual case studies that were looked at as a group, and they ultimately were able to see some patterns. So that's what case studies do for us, is they give us individual data that in the long run we might get enough reports that would allow us to look at patterns. Now, archival data is when you rely on archives, data that has been recorded for some other purpose. So in educational research, we oftentimes look at student grades. Like, we'll ask the registrar to send us all the names and student IDs removed, but maybe by major or some other factor that matters, age, something like that. And then we want, sorry, I touched my mic. We want the grades for everybody, right? And we're going to kind of look at like what factors go into grades or something. So that the repository of grades is called an archive. So a lot of employers maintain archives of different sorts on employees. You know, it goes in your permanent record, right? And so we might want to look at the permanent records or the employee files, and look for certain data that would be helpful for answering questions, right? You could do it in some kind of cross-sectional technique where maybe you pull the files for people who worked for the organization between 1950 and 1960, between 1970 and 1980, and between 2000 and 2010. And you ask for those separate groups and pull the archives, and you look for any trends or differences between the different eras. Or maybe you might do a longitudinal design where you follow employees from date of hire through some number of years or something like that, and see how they grow, change, and develop across that time. So, so archival research can be approached in lots of different ways. It's a beneficial strategy because a lot of times, for one thing, it's objective. You didn't record it, so you couldn't have been biased in how you decided what to look at and things like that, like you could be with an observation or a case study. But a big downside is the archive might not contain the very piece of data that you need in order to answer the question that you're posing. And so it's awesome, and it's also frustrating. Finally, there are surveys that we can use for collecting data. And of course, any good psychologist knows about surveys. There are different ways that we can do surveys. We can do self-administered, either on paper or on the internet, or we could have actual interviews on the phone or face-to-face. Some people like interviews because you can tailor the questions based on what the respondent is saying. I hate that about interviews because, as a good quantitative researcher, what am I supposed to do with the question, the answers that came up with one participant but were never asked of another participant? So I'm very reluctant to ever include any kind of interview technique. I like everything to be standardized and everybody sees the same thing, so that everything's apples to apples comparisons. So surveys in IO psychology are just like every other area of psychology. They are the most popular technique for collecting data in IO psychology. All right. Let's take a break here, and then we will move into measurement and a little bit of data in the next video.